refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. You can go forward to either page 97 or 98 of the prayer book, where there's the short mandala offering prayer. So it's going to be on either of those pages, depending on the version of the prayer book you have. We'll do that prayer, and then we'll continue on page 98 with the offering mantra, the Idam Guru, skipping over that verse to request to turn the wheel of Dharma. And then we'll do Refuge in Bodhicitta on page 98 as well, once in English, twice in Tibetan. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kam Niryatayami. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la changchu bardu dakni kyab suchi daki chunyan gi peso namgi jola penshir sangye drupa sho Sangye chodang soki choknam la changchu bardu dakni kyab suchi Daki chunyan gi peso namgi drola penshir sangye druparsho. You can set the prayer books aside. Let's do a short meditation before we have tonight's class. Give ourselves a chance in the meditation to focus the mind a bit, let go of whatever distractions, preoccupations we might have. Microphone just fell off. And then we'll set our motivation together. So I'll lead you in a short reflection to set motivation. So I'll ring the chime to begin the meditation period. In the first part, just pay attention to the breath and whatever technique suits your mind. And then, as I said, I'll lead you in a reflection after that. And now let's take a moment to adjust our motivation for being here. And beginning with that thought that is so fundamental to all of these teachings, which is the idea that every single sentient being is exactly the same. We ourselves know how much we want to be happy, how much we don't want to suffer. Well, it's the same for every single being. We're all in the same predicament in terms of wanting happiness, wanting to not suffer, but continuing to suffer, continuing to be bereft of true peace and happiness. So when we begin to cultivate this motivation of bodhicitta, it's rooted in that idea that there is no distinguishing then the welfare of one being from another, in a sense. That we have to be concerned equally about the welfare of each and every single sentient being. Because they're all fundamentally the same. And moreover, with this concept of Buddha nature, every one of these beings has the potential to find the peace and happiness that they seek, to find the bliss of Buddhahood, to be free of all that obscures the mind, all the causes of suffering and the suffering that results from that. To know this state that is our fundamental nature, this Buddha nature that can be developed into the state of a Buddha. So with this idea that we're all in the same predicament, the same boat, and we all have the potential to achieve the greatest possible result, bodhicitta is the only logical response to this. To say that we have to be dedicated to bringing all sentient beings into that state of complete enlightenment. Their welfare is our greatest concern. But in order to accomplish that, we absolutely have to become more capable. That means we ourselves have to become enlightened first. Once we have attained that state, we will then be endowed with the perfect wisdom, the complete compassion, and the skillful means and power to guide all of these beings to that state. So with those thoughts, reinforcing your mind of bodhicitta, generate that thought aspiring to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings in your heart right now, so that it becomes a cause for our being here. It informs all that we do while we're here this evening, and thereby, produces the result that we seek, which is the enlightenment of all sentient beings. Through our working with the Dharma, through our examining these teachings, through our coming to know our own minds, this will be the result. Okay. So maybe Paul probably needs a copy of the text. Paul, did you want a copy of the text to work with the pages? That's the prayer book. Yeah, Alex has a. So the text we're working with in this course, again, this is about our 28th session. Hard to believe we've been having that many of them. But we're working with this text that's on minds and mental factors. And the last time that we were here, we're kind of getting towards the end of these secondary afflictions. So recall that there were 6 main groups of mental factors. We started off looking at those that were omnipresent, the ones that are always there. Then we looked at the object determining that help us to know objects more clearly. Then we looked at the virtuous mental factors. Then we went on to the root afflictions. And then finally, we've gotten to the 5th category, which are the secondary afflictions. There are 20 of these. And they're called secondary, or sometimes the term proximate is used, because they're very near, close to the root afflictions. They're derived from them. They're offshoots of them. So there are ways that our minds get more disturbed on the basis of additional thinking that isn't so wholesome, isn't so correct. So we've been examining these, and again, I'll put up on the screen right now. Let me do that for everyone at home as well by doing the share screen. The slide that shows where these all derive from. So we made it up through laziness the last time that we were here, number 16. And we'll see that again, the three root delusions of anger, ignorance, and attachment, these three drive a good portion of them individually, but then also all three of these can be involved in some of them, and even in some cases two. So we did see a few that had attachment and ignorance, and then we're looking at a few. We have a couple more to go tonight, starting with our next one, non-conscientiousness. That derives from all three of these. It can come from ignorance, it can come from attachment, it can come from anger. So we are going to go forward and taking a look at non-conscientiousness, unless there were any questions or comments about what we did up to this point. I realize we didn't spend tons of time on laziness, but we looked at laziness some months ago when we looked at the virtuous mental factor of enthusiasm or effort, which is the antidote to laziness. Okay, so if there's no questions, let's go ahead and go back to the text. We're on page 79. This is where the 17th of these 20 secondary mental factors is discussed. It's non-conscientiousness. So again, we did see conscientiousness, the opposite of this, in the virtuous mental factors. And we might go back and revisit that as part of our discussion. It was back on pages 45 and 46. But let's first look at non-conscientiousness. The question comes in the compendium of knowledge as it says there, what is non-conscientiousness? Abiding with attachment, hatred, ignorance, as well as laziness, it is a non-cultivation of virtuous qualities and a non-guarding of the mind against contaminated phenomena. So it has the function of acting as a support for the increase of non-virtue and the decrease of virtue. So if we lack conscientiousness, this could also be called a lack of conscientiousness. If we don't have that ability to guard our minds, to encourage us to engage in virtue, to abandon non-virtue, then we are going to fall prey to those states of mind of committing non-virtue and not allowing our virtue to increase, as it says there. So it says, just as it has been said above, it is an awareness that, not guarding the mind against the hosts of afflictions and misdeeds, gives in to relaxation. Relaxation, it doesn't mean like lying in a hot tub necessarily or something. It just means we relax the mind. We don't have that guard up, or guard up to make sure that we're doing what we need to be doing. So through that relaxation of our guarding alertness, then we don't keep the mind in check, and then thereby keep our behavior in check. So in this regard, a discussion of the five aggregates, again, this is a text by Vasubandhu, says, this is towards the bottom of page 79, he also asks, what is non-conscientiousness? The response is, it is a non-guarding of the mind against afflictions due to attachment, hatred, ignorance, or laziness, and is a non-cultivation of virtue. So it was interesting, it said according to laziness, you might recall that when we talked about laziness, we even had afflictions that it was derived from, right? I think laziness was from, ignorance, yeah. So we just went through laziness in the last class, and it derives from ignorance. So it's not to say that it is identical to ignorance, but frequently ignorance is the factor that leads to us being lazy. And recall that laziness isn't just the lounging around and not doing anything, kind of that more lethargic response to things, but rather it also is where we get attached to all the busy, mundane things that we have in our lives, and we also have the laziness of despondency, where we feel like we can't do it, self-deprecation, that type of thing. So again, any of those are related more to ignorance, but nonetheless, laziness is identified as one of the afflictions that can also be there, giving rise to non-conscientiousness. So besides attachment, anger, and ignorance, which are the three root delusions, we can also have some of this due to laziness. It is simply to be understood that its function is as stated above. That's all that's said about non-conscientiousness. Let me go back briefly in our text to conscientiousness. We're not going to look at all of that because we looked at it previously. Again, this was on pages 45 and 46. Let's just look at the definition on page 45 of the text. There, it was looking at what is conscientiousness. It is a cultivation of virtuous qualities within abiding in non-attachment, non-hatred, non-ignorance as well as effort. So it's interesting. The exact opposites of the four that we saw in the presentation of non-conscientiousness are here. To have non-hatred, non-attachment, non-ignorance, those are against the three root delusions. And then to have effort or enthusiasm, which is counteracting our laziness. And it guards the mind against contaminations. So it kind of keeps us from being contaminated with the delusions. This is a major mental factor that's important in our practice, is to have that ability to be conscientious as to what's going on in our minds, how we are acting in the world, and so on. So I'm not going to talk much more about that. I just thought I'd point out that similarity there in terms of it being related to the three opposites of the delusions that were mentioned in the context of non-conscientiousness. So let's go ahead and move to the slides where I share. I've been doing this in all the classes, thanks to the kindness of Geshe Rabten, who gave those teachings many years ago, as well as Stephen Batchelor, who translated them. We have Geshe Rabten's teachings on the mental factors. There, the term was unconscientiousness. I don't know, it's the same idea. Is a mental factor that, when one is affected by laziness, wishes to freely act in an unrestrained manner without cultivating virtue or guarding the mind against contaminated phenomena. It is a quality ascribed to any of the three mental poisons when they are accompanied by laziness. So in his presentation, he kind of throws laziness in there as accompanying all of them. And then with laziness, one could have attachment, one could have anger, one could have ignorance. But nonetheless, it might even still be some instances where laziness perhaps would be a bit more distinct or on its own. But considering again that laziness is a secondary mental, secondary affliction that is related to ignorance, I guess you always have some level of ignorance present. Geshe Rabten continues and says it has the function of increasing non-virtue, we saw this in our text, right, and obstructing virtue, as well as causing any positive individual qualities to be destroyed. In brief, it vitiates, I don't know how it's pronounced, I didn't look it up. It means it counteracts, it goes against all five powers. So those of you who were here for the discussion of Ornament Chapter 4 of the text by Maitreya Buddha, know that the five powers were discussed in that text. It's part of what are called the 37 Harmonies with Enlightenment. Anyway, there's a footnote where Geshe Rabten does talk about that, or where Stephen Batchelor may have inserted the footnote. The five powers are qualities specifically cultivated on the heat and peak stages of the path of preparation. So again, the path of preparation, there are five paths for the Bodhisattva, and there are also five on the Hinayana path. You have the path of accumulation, or sometimes Rinpoche calls this now the path of merit, and then path of preparation. Path of preparation has 4 levels. Heat and peak are the first 2, and tolerance or patience and supreme mundane quality are the other 2. So the path of preparation itself is where these 5 powers grow and become more prevalent, more important. They're obviously important prior to that as well, but they help you to get to the path of seeing, which is your first direct insight into emptiness that occurs. And then you go on to the path of meditation, increasing the power of your wisdom along with the merit that's accumulated to remove all the remaining obscurations until you achieve the path of no more learning. So these 5 powers, in the slide it says these are the powers of faith, recollection, enthusiasm, concentration, and intelligence or wisdom. When cultivated on the patience and supreme Dharma stages of the path of preparation, they are known as the 5 strengths. So they're sometimes called, again, the 5 powers in the first part, 5 strengths, or there's 5 forces, I think was another term that I heard for those on the latter part of the path of preparation. But these are kind of, again, not to say that they're only there at these times, because obviously we need faith, we need enthusiasm, concentration, and so on, all of these on our path. But this is where they take a more instrumental role in helping us, as I said, to prepare to have our direct insight into emptiness. So in going back to that previous slide then, what Geshe Rabten was saying is that it goes against, it diminishes, it takes the life out of our 5 powers. It doesn't allow them to be manifest. I mean, certainly we can see enthusiasm or effort is one of them. So the fact that we have this non-conscientiousness that is deriving in part from laziness, from not being that attentive to our minds and so on, then this is something that will not allow any enthusiasm or effort in our practice to arise. And therefore we won't go on to have concentration or wisdom, our own recollection. I don't know about this term recollection. I didn't go back to the text to see how we translated that when we did the ornament. I don't think it was recollection. I think there was another term. Mindfulness, I think, was the term. So I think this is, what recollection, as I recollect now, was what, because that was a while ago when we looked at mindfulness, right? Because that's one of the object determining mental factors. That was the term that Geshe Rabten used for, or Stephen Batchelor used for that mental factor. So faith, mindfulness, enthusiasm or effort, concentration, and intelligence. So as I said, you need all of those before you even get to that point. But nonetheless, on the path of preparation, they're extremely important. According to its function, Geshe Rabten says there are two kinds of non-conscientiousness or unconscientiousness, that which makes the mind unconscientious and that which makes both body and mind unconscientious. And by body there, I think they would include your speech. I mean, your speech is a product of your body. They're not trying to make it into just physical and mental and not verbal. I think they're including just both body and mind. They're meaning anything that derives from the physical elements in the body versus that which is only mental. So we didn't have this division, and a lot of these divisions at Geshe Rabten, I don't know where he got them from, what text he was citing, but these are not something that we find in our text by Yeshe Geltzen. So that was all that was said in terms of non-conscientiousness. Yeah, Bob?
Yeah, I mean, what occurs to me is really neat, but it's really basic to say that when you have these three root afflictions present, you got to fight against them. You can't just let go and give into them.
Yeah.
And if you don't fight against them, then you generate this non-conscientious secondary affliction.
Yeah, so Bob was just saying that, when we have the three root delusions, or of course, could I assume mean any of the variations, and if we don't fight against them or put some sort of barrier by being conscientious, by being, attentive, then they take over and we lose the force of our practice. So again, it can be a real barrier. Non-conscientiousness would seem like it would be there, like similar to non-shame and non-embarrassment that we talked about previously. It seems like this one would be there with a lot of our misbehavior or other mental states that would be arising. Because as it says here, it's not just when we are physically or verbally acting, it's also that which makes the mind non-conscientious. So, yeah, Alex?
I find it interesting in these laws that it's basically saying that even if you're not doing bad stuff, if you're not doing good stuff, you're doing bad stuff. It's
Yeah,
like
it's a
doing bad stuff, but you're just not paying attention to how you do. And that's, if anything, you're wasting the time and space and opportunity. But it also just wants to push you to be aware and be more and don't look at it. Be alert to how you're doing. And that alertness in itself then will push towards doing positive things. Rather than just allowing yourself to do it.
So Alex was, for those of you online, Alex was just pointing out the idea that, it's interesting how they throw in that idea of it's not just that non-conscientiousness allows you to engage in non-virtue, but it also blocks you from engaging in virtue. And so you end up kind of wasting your time if you don't, when you have this precious opportunity of not engaging in more virtuous activity. You don't have to be engaging in non-virtue, but that's going to also be a problem, an obstacle, that you're not engaging in virtue at that time. Yeah, Bob?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually paying close attention to that when I was reading it. I was wondering this question. What if you're in a neutral state?
Yeah.
Is this saying that there's a secondary affliction? You're not pursuing virtue when you're just sort of idling and nothing else is going on. But as I read this, the beginning says, it says abiding in these three non-virtues. Then, when you don't fight against it, then that's when you generate the secondary affliction. So when I read it, when I read this thing, it seemed to be saying to me,
go back to,
it's not just when you're in a neutral state, if you're not trying to cultivate virtuous qualities, generating the secondary. But to me, it feels more like giving in to the other afflictions. So when the other afflictions are present, so it's a sort of subtle point, but I was sort of wondering that same question that Alex was raising, which part of it is this?
Yeah.
But to me, when it says abiding with attachment, hatred, and ignorance, it sort of seems to be that it's when you don't cultivate the virtuous qualities while you're abiding with attachment, hatred.
Right.
So it's sort of a subtle point, but it's sort of an interesting thing.
Yeah. So
whether it's whether you have to push for virtue when you're in a neutral state, or when it's really this affliction arises when you're in the presence of other.
So Bob, for those online, Bob was making the point that in response to what Alex was bringing up, that he was reading, going back to the definition and say where it's abiding with attachment, hatred, ignorance, as well as laziness, so that there has to be a kind of maybe a more, it's not just when you're in neutral and not and coasting and not doing anything, but when you are actually making no effort to combat those things and hanging out in that space. But I guess I guess we have to go into, well, when are we in neutral and what's really going on? A lot of our neutral parts of the day or of our lives might be where we are succumbing to laziness. We might not be sitting around fantasizing and developing all kinds of attachment or whatever, but maybe we're just really, again, abiding in a state of laziness, almost, of just, I don't know, decline of practice at that time. So it's really hard to say. I mean, once more, we have to say that there has to be something that is flavoring the mind in a non-virtuous way for it to become non-virtue. And so if that's why, again, I found it interesting that on the slide that I have on the screen now, that it's saying that when one is affected by laziness, wishes to freely act in an unrestrained manner without cultivating virtue or guarding the mind against contamination. So it's reading it as always together with this laziness, which it could actually be written that way too, because the way our description is from Compendium of Knowledge, it says abiding with attachment, hatred, ignorance, as well as laziness. Like that, if you have any of those three as well as laziness, so it's almost like an offshoot of laziness, but it's a different state of mind, obviously, because it's one that doesn't allow us to guard the mind at that time, because we're not fully engaged, because we're not. So interesting stuff to discuss as to when do our minds become more non-virtuous. I think if we were avoiding virtue due to laziness, then obviously it becomes non-virtuous, because then we have that factor present. But if we're avoiding virtue because we're sleeping or something, well, then we're also not very conscientious while we're sleeping, perhaps, but we're not doing anything non-virtuous necessarily, because we haven't gotten to sleep yet. The mental factor of sleep, which isn't what we mean by physical sleep, but it is the mind that is induced when we go into physical sleep, is its own mental factor that can vary depending upon what we do with it. So anyway, these are interesting points to think about and to contemplate. I wish there was more written on non-conscientiousness. Even like I said, Venerable George's commentary was extremely brief on this. I only think like one sentence or something. Really wasn't much written about it. So, any other comments or? Yeah.
I'm looking forward to see how it's going to connect with distraction.
Yeah. Distraction is almost a bit even more active in a sense, but obviously not something that we're without, because. And distraction, again, when we get to distraction, we're going to talk about it in terms of it being an affliction, but distraction can happen even without it being, it might be something virtuous that distracts us. So anyway, but shall we move on? Let me get back to where we were in terms of the slides, just so that, oh wait, there may be a question on the thing. Let me stop the share from here. Rowena says, we have been lazing around in samsara for a long time. It's easy to slide into distraction. So let's keep moving on, and we'll get to distraction very soon. The next one that we have on our list is number 18, forgetfulness. As we saw from that earlier slide, forgetfulness arises from ignorance. So there's not much written on forgetfulness here, but obviously we see forgetfulness very common. It's presented as one of the main obstacles that we have in our meditation practice in particular. So the Compendium of Knowledge on page 80, at the top it says, what is forgetfulness? It is a mindfulness that is concomitant with afflictions. It has the function of acting as a support for distraction. So these kind of ones that we're looking at, the non-conscientiousness, forgetfulness, distraction, even non-introspection, which is the next one, these are all things that are going to arise so much more in our meditation as well. They're going to become problematic for us, not allowing us to make the most use of that time. Just as it has been said above, it is a knower that is an unclear mind and forgetful with respect to virtue on account of mindfulness of an object of observation of affliction. So it was kind of interesting. It used that term, it called it a mindfulness, and you wonder, well, that sounds like it might be something good, but it's a mindfulness of something that is not the object you're supposed to be mindful of. So you are mindful of something else. You are mindful of, here of an afflictive object, because this is the affliction of forgetfulness. This isn't like, oh, I forgot my keys, or I forgot to lock the door, or whatever we might have other forgetfulness around. But this is, being mindful of an object of observation of the affliction. So we go to that rather than remaining on the object that we are supposed to be on. So, for example, forgetfulness happens when we talk about the meditation to develop calm abiding. You're given an instruction to stay on the object of meditation, which in the case of like the breath, or in the case of a visualized Buddha, or if you're doing tantric practice, to stay focused on self-generation or whatever it is that you're focusing on. And so that's where the mind is supposed to be. That's when you're engaging in your practice with a more virtuous state of mind. And then when you get forgetful of that, you lose that, the mindfulness of that object, but then you become mindful of, start wondering what's in the refrigerator, and you get some attachment to all the things that you think you might want to eat or whatever. So this is a forgetfulness of the mind, because it's not allowing you to be with your object of focus. So it's kind of interesting. It will come up then, obviously, often with other delusions, but nonetheless, it's saying here that it's arising primarily out of ignorance, because it is not being attentive at that time to the object you're supposed to be on. So it's while you could be distracted and move on to other things, that's why distraction also plays a role in this. We saw that, right? It's a support for distraction. Once you have the forgetfulness manifesting, then there's room for all kinds of other things to come in. Once you've lost the object, then who knows where you're going to go. So, yeah, Bob.
Yeah, it seems to me like this would be like a cause of distraction. Because, because the distraction is the turning many different objects instead of sticking with your main meditation object.
No.
And here, the reason why you would be distracted from your main meditation object is because you find some other non-virtuous thing so attractive.
Right,
your mind gets stuck, gets drawn to it, stuck to it.
Yeah. So Bob was just saying, that it makes sense that this is a cause for distraction. It says a support cause. I think they're pretty equivalent. And that, that the chain of things follow from there. We lose the object, our mindfulness of the object we're meditating on, because we are now mindful of something else. And then distraction occurs through the force of that. And again, distraction can play a role in a lot of other ways. When we get to distraction, the 20th of these, we'll see that there are a number of divisions to it, not all of which are necessarily, again, non-virtues. So continuing on in our text, it says, similarly, a discussion of the five aggregates also explains forgetfulness to be an afflicted mindfulness, whereby an unclear, forgetful, virtuous mind should be called forgetfulness. However, since the objects of observation of afflictions, pleasant and unpleasant characteristics and so forth, do not arise as objects of awareness of such a virtuous mind, perhaps it should not be posited as forgetfulness. So we're not talking about here about the forgetfulness that moves to an object where we would be engaged in more virtue, or something that is a virtuous object of the mind at that time. Nonetheless, that is not what we ideally want to be practicing, but we're really talking about afflicted forgetfulness here. This was called an afflicted mindfulness even, whereby an unclear mind arises that is directed towards that which is non-virtuous or afflicted. We shouldn't be equating those two all the time, non-virtuous and afflicted, because they're not necessarily so, as we saw earlier. But with most of what we have in the 20 secondary afflictions, they are so, because when they're arising, there's usually a flavor of non-virtue to the mind, because it's together with the root afflictions, which are generally non-virtuous as well. So then it says, forgetfulness acts as a support for distraction, because in dependence on afflicted mindfulness, the mind will be distracted to an object of observation of the afflictions. You know, so the forgetfulness happens once more. The mind gets drawn then into an afflicted object, and because it's together often with non-virtuous states of mind as well, it becomes problematic for us. So let's look at what Geshe Rabten says about this, and then and I even threw in maybe one or two other things. I can't remember what I did for this one. Let me share it with the folks online. Forgetfulness is a mental factor, he says, that having caused the apprehension of a wholesome referent to be lost, induces recollection of and distraction towards a disturbing referent. Kind of technical way of talking about it. The mind losing its apprehension of what's wholesome, that it's intended to be focused on, and induces this mindfulness of something else, an afflicted mindfulness towards a disturbing referent or a afflicted object. It has the function of destroying the vessel which contains all wholesome qualities and of causing the power of recollection or mindfulness to decline. Thus it leads one to apprehend objects that disturb the mind. So it's kind of interesting, the power of recollection. I mean, what he's almost talking about here is the way we were talking about it just previously in terms of the 5 powers, right? The power of recollection there, or the power of mindfulness, is a virtuous state of mind in that context. Recall that mindfulness itself is not virtuous or non-virtuous. It is a mental factor that helps us to discern objects, that determine objects. It's one of the 5 that are involved in that category. But mindfulness is obviously an important tool for getting at virtuous objects, for working with virtuous objects, for improving the quality of our minds. So I think what he's talking about here, of causing the power of recollection to decline, means the power of wholesome recollection, wholesome mindfulness to diminish. Thus it leads one to apprehend objects that disturb the mind, and by virtue of that, diminish, the qualities that we're trying to build. Yeah, Bob?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You compare this with the previous one.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you have the previous one saying you have to actively fight against it.
Oh, this the previous mental factor. Yeah.
But this one seems saying that not only do you have to do that, you have to sort of watch your mind and not let it be wrong and not virtuous objects.
Yeah.
Fight against that.
Yeah. So Bob was just saying that, if we put non-conscientiousness, the previous mental factor, with this forgetfulness, that we see that this one pairs with that, and the first one, kind of making sure that we aren't succumbing to those states of mind, but here how we have to kind of be quite involved in maintaining our mindfulness, our recollection of the wholesome objects that we're working with. So these are, and again, when we talk about all these mental factors, we can observe them to some degree in ourselves, but they often are acting in tandem. I mean, that's the thing is, the virtuous ones act in tandem, and the non-virtuous or afflicted states act in tandem. So again, one can lead right into the other. It was even interesting in that previous slide, Geshe Rabten seemed to, it says it induces this mindfulness of and distraction towards a disturbing referent. But it actually, kind of flows right one into the other. I mean, it's not like you can say, oh, this is where the forgetfulness ends and the distraction begins or whatever. They're all part and parcel of what goes on in our minds, because everything happens really quite quickly. So a few more slides from what Geshe Rabten says. He says, here forgetfulness refers to a mental factor that, in addition to losing sight of what is wholesome, draws one into an apprehension of what is unwholesome. So this is, again, what delineates it as something more than just losing our mindfulness. It means that we are actually now mindful of something non-virtuous, a much more kind of active way of being involved. It does not correspond at all to what we usually understand by forgetting something. So what I said earlier, simply being unable to retain a memory of an object in the mind, or to have, forgetful experiences. This is in particular when we forget what is wholesome that we are intending to engage in or practice, and engage in what is unwholesome. In fact, it is a form of recollection that disturbs the mind by involving it with contaminated objects. This negative form of forgetfulness is a great obstacle to the accomplishment of any task, either our mundane or our spiritual, tasks that we are setting about. Then he gives some divisions of forgetfulness. There are two aspects of forgetfulness: that which comes about through the force of being unclear about a wholesome referent, and that which comes about through the force of being attentive toward a disturbing referent. So kind of sees there's two aspects of it. It doesn't, again, talk about them as being, I think, kind of two distinct things, because once more, we can talk about it from the point of view that while I am engaged and attentive towards a disturbing referent, mindful of that, then at that time I'm also not clear and mindful of a wholesome referent, because it's been supplanted by that. Okay. Yeah, Alex.
I had this image in a child, as a child, when I was raised with a small town, and we would walk to the library in school, you know, and the teacher would have these little children walking like little ducks or something, kind of go off to the library. So this is coming to mind in this instance, because if you're just walking along and you forgot that there were supposed to be 6 kids and 4, you know, that's one of the problems. And then the other thing is, if you don't know, there's a dam right there, and if the kids are playing near it, and they slide in, they could fall, they could be injured. So that's the other one, being inattentive towards a disturbing reference. So this image, visual image is something.
So Alex was just sharing, I won't go into all the detail, but an image of like when she was young, and there was a person who would take the students from the library, grade school to the library. And so if you weren't attentive to the number of students that were following you as you were parading them across to the library, then that might be the one part of it, of not being attentive to the virtue, and then or the wholesome aspect. And then you also have to be attentive to make sure they don't slide into the ditch or something, or what was it? Or there was a dam. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, the fence, and then anyway, all these sort of distracting components. So you also want to make sure that nothing unwholesome happens. So again, and like I said, I think in our minds these are happening almost simultaneously, because once more, as soon as say you're sitting down and you're meditating on compassion, or you're doing something that's really quite virtuous with your mind, and then suddenly you find yourself drawn to something that is unwholesome, and so then you no longer have the retention, the clear mind focusing on what is virtuous, and you now have something that has supplanted it. So they do kind of rise in tandem. But keep in mind, I didn't put this slide in there. I thought I had. That's why I was mentioning earlier. I thought I had put in the slide about the 5 faults and the 8 antidotes. We've seen that a number of times in the context of many of these. That the second fault was forgetting the instruction. That's forgetfulness. And that essentially doesn't mean forgetting the instruction like some special instruction you're given. It means forgetting the object. If you are intending to meditate on a particular object, that's your instruction, is to meditate on compassion or emptiness or the Buddha image or whatever it is that you are focusing on. And then at that time, when you lose it, you've forgotten the instruction, then what you need is, as the antidote to that, is mindfulness, is to restore your mindfulness of the virtuous object. So the counteracting force is to remember what it is that you are doing. Have that recollection, the force of that brings you back to the present and to what it is that you're engaged in. So we didn't really talk about the antidote to like non-conscientiousness, but I guess it's conscientiousness, which again, but how do you develop that kind of guarding in the mind? Obviously, it's just something that comes with more and more practice. We may initially need something to remind us of that type of conscientiousness. This is where I'm a total fan of like people using physical tools to remember certain things of how they want to be, or thoughts that they want to make sure that they entertain during the day that are more wholesome and what have you. So find whatever works for you, but recognize that it's something that you may need physical supports to get there. But the idea is to have the mind train that well, so that we never allow our conscientiousness to drop, and we never allow our mindfulness of the virtue that we want to engage in to diminish. So any other comments on this factor of forgetfulness? All right, let's look at non-introspection. I've mentioned previously that introspection, it was one of the antidotes to the next fault that we saw in the 5 faults, which was the non-application or non-identification of laxity and excitement. And those 2 in particular are identified as the main obstacles to developing calm abiding. Introspection, which is the opposite of this, is seen as being this factor in the mind that is like a spy that checks in to make sure that our minds are doing what we need to be doing. And so we talk about it frequently in the context of meditation because it's what is allowing us to check the quality of our meditation at any time to see, am I still with the object that I'm focusing on? Have these duller states of mind or more excited states of mind arisen? What is going on? And then on the basis of what introspection finds out, then you make correction, you make adjustment. You apply whatever antidotes need to be applied. But if you're not identifying what's going on, if you're just kind of hanging out and thinking, oh, I'm just sitting here and having a good time sitting on my cushion or whatever, and you're not really, checking in to see what the quality of your meditation is, then there's a major fault right there. That's the 3rd fault of the 5 faults in developing calm abiding. So I probably should have put that slide in here, but nonetheless, you've seen it before. So, and most of you are quite familiar with these 5 faults and 8 antidotes to calm abiding, which is one of the major things that, again, we do see in a number of these mental factors, because they either play a role in helping us to acquire that or in hindering our acquisition of calm abiding. So non-introspection obviously is not just happening then, at that time. It's also throughout our lives in terms of how we are in the world and so on. It says from the compendium, this is page 80 in the middle, what is non-introspection? A wisdom that is concomitant with afflictions and engages unknowingly in activities of body, speech, and mind. It has the function of acting as a support for infractions, misbehavior, going against the ideal behavior we want to be upholding. Just as it has been said above, it is an afflicted wisdom. Again, when we use the term wisdom, everyone thinks it's such a positive thing, and obviously correct wisdom is, valid wisdom is. But we saw afflicted wisdom being used as the definition for all 5 of the wrong view, or the afflicted views, right? It's an afflicted intelligence, an afflicted wisdom. So we can have a way of discerning things, which is what wisdom is all about, and kind of analyzing them and coming to understand them, that can be afflicted, can be not in line with reality. So this is a form of an afflicted wisdom. I've mentioned previously that, and I had heard that from a number of my other teachers, that introspection, although it's not on our list of mental factors, would be included in wisdom. It's a factor of our intelligence or our wisdom that is observing and seeing what's going on, that spy in the corner of our mind. So it makes sense that non-introspection would be an afflicted wisdom. It's when we use our wisdom, but we're not using it in a way where we are getting at what really needs to be practiced. Instead, we're tending to follow the opposite, and we end up, again, engaging in infractions, as it says. So it engages unknowingly in activities of the 3 doors. So it's kind of interesting it says unknowingly. I don't know what to say about that. I guess unknowingly could be referring to the fact that it's not doing so with a more correct wisdom, with a deeper analysis of what's actually happening. Our non-introspection, again, is probably there with a lot of our misbehavior. It says that this non-introspection acts as a support for infractions, accords with what is said in engaging in the bodhisattva deeds. This is Shantideva's text, verse 26 of chapter 5, which is usually the chapter that's called Guarding Alertness or introspection. So let's just read this verse together. Even though learned, faithful, and diligent in effort, many become tainted by downfalls due to the fault of lacking introspection. So I don't know. I mean, again, this idea that engages unknowingly, I don't think it means that it's something that you're not therefore engaged, you're not therefore aware of it completely. I think the idea is that it's following the wrong knowledge, and so in that way it's kind of not knowing. I don't know. I didn't look up the other translation to see what they used for that, if they used the same term of unknowingly. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I take unknowingly mean the same thing as not paying attention.
Yeah.
Because when you're paying attention, you know what the
Right.
that sense of the word. So
Uh-huh.
if you don't know what you're doing because you're not paying attention, that is, in my mind, sort of an unknowing. Because
Yeah.
introspection seems to be mainly paying attention to what you're doing, which is sort of knowing what you're doing.
Right. Let me see what Bob was just saying. Yeah, it kind of seems to be a. What was the exact phrase that you used? That
Unknowing is the same as
not paying attention. Yeah. Let me see what it says here. It said non-introspection isn't. This is the translation from Montenegro, I think is the man's name, Vincent Montenegro, who did another translation of this text. It's available as a download on Amazon. And he says, non-introspection is an afflicted intelligence, same as what we saw, afflicted wisdom, that engages in activities of the three doors of body, speech, and mind without introspection and is irreconcilable with introspection. So he didn't even use the term unknowingly in there. Engages in activities of the three doors of body, speech, and mind without introspection. It's kind of, that's how he defined unknowingly. So it's kind of like without being aware of what's going on, in a sense, it seems. What were you going to say, Rachel?
In the types of mind,
Mm-hmm.
one of them is the
Inattentive mind.
well, it's the one that it's without ascertainment. So you're aware of something without ascertaining it. So say somebody, an ant walks across the floor, you're not aware of that ant doing it, but you actually do observe that through your sense consciousness. So there's
it's appearing but not ascertained. Yeah.
Appearing but not ascertained. And I'm wondering if this is non-introspection.
I don't know if it is or not. I'm getting the feeling that it's more of like, I like actually the way Vincent Montenegro defined it as being without introspection. It's like you are not engaging your introspective component of your mind. So you're therefore not using that sort of other level of awareness, that spy, to be in charge of what's going on, to know what's going on, to be aware of what's going on, and then to correct things accordingly. So it acts as a doorway for moral downfalls and for us to engage in misbehavior, because we don't have that factor of some part of our mind that is observing and checking up. So I don't know if it's quite the same thing. I don't know. Yeah, Alex.
I think in terms of being rude and being inconsiderate, because some people will say, "Oh, how rude," and the fact is, the other person may be rude, but maybe what's really going on is they just didn't consider it. Because they weren't considerate, they were inconsiderate, and it had an impact. So the lack of engaging in this attitude of considering more than yourself or whatever else is going on at the moment, some people, their bubble is just too small.
Yeah.
So that's how I see, see this.
So let me explain to those folks online what first I missed what Rachel, I didn't share what Rachel had said, but perhaps you heard it from the microphone being close to Rachel, but she was relating it back to the first part of minds and awarenesses, where we didn't do that here this time, but some of you have done that study where we look at the different types of awarenesses in a bigger bucket. And there are some where you have an object that's appearing but not ascertained, these types of inattentive awarenesses. And I was just saying, that I'm not sure it's quite the same thing. Alex was sharing the idea that you might have some people who might be perceived as being rude or insensitive or whatever, when they're simply not able to consider things beyond the scope of where their awareness is at. So they might say something or do something that other people would interpret in that way because they don't have the room to consider it. And that's, I think, what you were saying.
They are being inconsiderate because they are not.
Yeah, but that almost, with this word usage of them being inconsiderate, almost harkens me back then to the lack of consideration or the non-embarrassment, where people are not. That's almost that mental factor. I think what we're talking about here with this mental factor is you are simply not having your introspection present. You are not having that, which don't remember what class it was that I was talking about, the angel and the devil that used to be on the shoulders, in the cartoons, right? You have the little angel going, "Oh, you should go do something really good," and then the devil's going, "No, you should skip school and go play," and whatever. So you have kind of the introspection. It's not that just the introspection is just this sort of neutral sort of thing that doesn't really play any role. It's a really important part of our practice and is intended to guide us in a more virtuous direction. But obviously, I suppose there can be negative versions of introspection where you are kind of trying to be alert and attentive to following a non-virtuous state of mind. But in the context of what we're looking at, introspection is a key part of maintaining the integrity of our practice. And so when we lack that introspection, when we don't have that introspection, then we see that it allows us to go along with the afflictions. It says there, it does say, engages unknowingly, even in our definition, in activities of body, speech, and mind. I don't know if it's really unknowingly in the sense that it's like you're off the hook then, because you're not knowing that you're doing it. It's more that you aren't holding that additional awareness that would disallow you from going there. So in that sense, you're not applying that factor of introspection that would be a deterrent. That would say, "Oh, wow, look at where my mind's going. I need to correct that. Look at where my speech is going. I need to correct that." You see what I'm saying? I don't know. Yeah, Bob, were you going to share something?
Yeah, I'm just curious. The fact that he's calling it wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
then it refines it by calling it an afflicted wisdom.
Sure.
So I went back to page 31.
Right.
About wisdom.
Right.
And basically, what it says about wisdom,
Uh-huh.
when it talks about wisdom, it talks about knowing or not knowing.
Right.
What it talks about is discerning whether the qualities
Right.
of the thing are good or bad.
Right.
And so I'm sort of wondering that, when you have introspection,
Uh-huh.
that's when you're aware of what you're doing is either good or bad.
Right.
So if you have introspection, that is, in a sense, sort of a wisdom, sort of a discerning
Right.
the good or bad qualities of what you're doing. So I'm wondering if afflicted here, it doesn't mean sort of is the sense of being damaged, that your wisdom is damaged. It's not doing a job of discerning what you're doing.
Well, and again, so Bob was just pointing out, when we go back to the definition of wisdom, because this is defined as an afflicted wisdom, which we've seen in also, again, all of the wrong views or afflicted views. They were all described as an afflicted wisdom, an afflicted intelligence. That there's this idea then that it's somehow kind of gone askew, that there is nothing to sort of correct that, to be aware, because while wisdom is simply differentiating the qualities of things, it could be differentiating them in an incorrect way, and saying, "Oh, this is really good, this is really bad," but not being aware of that. Whereas introspection allows you to have that awareness that knows what's good or bad, that knows through the force of one's learning and so on what one needs to follow. I think that's kind of the idea, really to understand that without any introspection, without that second level of awareness that checks in to see what's going on, we don't have a sort of control potentially, and our wisdom can start running amok and thinking that everything we're doing is perfectly fine. These get to be interesting to kind of pick apart all the little components of our minds and what they're doing. But I find it always so interesting that introspection wasn't identified as a separate mental factor in the 50 whatever. We've got 51. It would have been 52 then. And that's, as I said, because most teachers I've had have said that it was part of wisdom. So it's it itself is wisdom. So does it make sense if we've seen here that non-introspection is an afflicted wisdom, for then introspection to be a non-afflicted wisdom, where one is seeing things correctly? So maybe that's why, again, we could probably put both of them into the category of wisdom, but why non-introspection is probably singled out is because we have to have a strong awareness when we lack that. I don't know. Do you have anything more to add, Rachel?
Not really, except to repeat. Just that I think that when it's pointing out that it's an afflicted wisdom, it can't be a non-afflicted wisdom because it's an afflicted mental factor.
Right.
But if you think about non-introspection as a thing,
Mm-hmm.
and you were to try to categorize it, even though it's not operating with wisdom, like with a proper sense of wisdom.
Okay.
I guess it's still placed in that category. Is that?
Yeah, and so the question is, yeah, even though it's can't be a non-afflicted wisdom because it's an affliction, it still must have some of what wisdom is doing, which is the discerning of qualities or the distinguishing of qualities, albeit in a erroneous, a faulty way that encourages us to then engage in misbehavior. So again, I suppose that if we lack introspection, I mean, and we would probably lack a lot of other things at the same time, as we were talking about with Alex's thing of lacking consideration for others or lacking our own sense of personal self-respect and shame or whatever, that if we use the example of when we're out with people and, say people are starting to drink and talk more freely, and then suddenly someone starts saying things about somebody else that they know are not necessarily good to say about that person, that are demeaning or derogatory. And then they just keep going on with it. They're engaging in their own kind of personal discernment or distinguishing that what they're saying is perfectly fine, or they would stop saying it, right? I mean, if we don't stop doing it, then we must have some assenting to it being okay to do. And we're lacking the introspection to check in at that time and go, oh, wow, I'm getting into some pretty heavy duty stuff, gossiping about somebody else, saying negative things about somebody else, demeaning somebody else. So you're lacking the introspection at that time. It doesn't seem to me that it's as active necessarily. It's a sense of an absence of something. So it becomes an afflicted wisdom by virtue of that. One tends to be driven then more towards the attachment, the ignorance, all these other things that are manifesting.
But it's kind of like it's definitely an afflicted wisdom because it's my mind's too afflicted. It's really not clear, and it's therefore it's not arriving at. And if we didn't have the affliction, that wisdom would arise clearly.
The more proper wisdom would arise more clearly had we not kind of followed the affliction and opened up the door for the affliction, lacking the introspection that would shut the door.
And it feels like it's that forgetfulness is almost that.
Yeah, I mean, these two kind of run into forgetfulness. I think does play a role in this. I think they all kind of combine together in some way to. So we're talking about mentally isolating, again, just various aspects of our mind, not to concretize them, but to understand that it's quite an involved process, and that any of these things could potentially break break it up. If we had the introspection present, then perhaps we would be more diligent in not going down that corridor, not following those delusions, not allowing them to prosper in our minds. Or if we had the conscientiousness, or if we had the mindfulness and weren't forgetting what it is how we're supposed to be in the world. So all of these, I think, can be deterrents. But we need to know what's the right one to apply with the situation that we're facing. Yeah, Alex?
I think, too, is what's really potent is that we're right in the middle of it. We're not, always good and doing the right thing, really clear. Most of us are somewhere in the, I shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah.
They're reminding ourselves and re-educating ourselves and watching
Right.
attitudes that aren't talking about and how to stay alert to them. And so this having these little steps and these pieces broken up even more ago, it's helpful to say, that was right there.
Right. So Alex was just pointing out how most of us are in that kind of gray zone where we're trying to figure out what to do, and having these tools and these ways of increasing our awareness so that we are more attentive to what's going on is really useful, because we do have some awareness of what we're doing is not correct, but we don't always have the strength of mind to be able to combat it, so it's not like we're completely oblivious to it or completely believing that what we're doing is perfectly fine. But I did want to share, because Rowena did share something in the chat box. She says, I am acquainted with a student that seems to have been trained to be scathing towards others. He's very intelligent, but continually judges others using negative thoughts. And his behavior always surprises me because we are accustomed to kindness. So I don't know. This example, I guess, could be, again, somebody who we could say is an example of this non-introspection, lacking introspection. It could also, again, be lacking other knowledge that one has become conditioned to a particular behavior, like she says, to be quite scathing towards others, even though you might be very smart, you know. And Rowena says, yeah, also lacks knowledge.
That's a training.
Yeah, yeah.
That the more intelligent or you are, the more definitely
Yeah,
about the inadequacy of others.
yeah.
Kind of a little close.
Yeah. So yeah, Alex was just saying it can be something that you definitely can be trained in doing. And if you are quite intelligent, sometimes that may be part of how you manifest in the world then, is to cut people down, to always feel that sense of superiority and what have you. But so were there any other comments on this one? Shall we move along? It's about 8 o'clock. I think we may be able to get through distraction. We'll see. Distraction is the longest section that we've seen in a while. Some of these really didn't go on for very long, but distraction, there's a lot. On page, did we do Geshe Repton's thing? I think we did, didn't we? I don't know. Let me go back to the slides and I can tell.
I don't think so.
Okay, we didn't do Geshe Repton, so let me go back to that. Let me share it with folks at home. We didn't. See, forgetfulness. There it was interesting. The term that was used was inattentiveness. You know, not paying attention is what Bob was saying earlier. I think that's kind of maybe a way of discussing this. Inattentiveness is a mental factor that, being an afflicted state of intelligence which has made no or only a rough analysis, is not fully aware of the conduct of one's body, speech, and mind, and thus causes one to enter a state of careless indifference. So again, because we lack that, we kind of don't have the full awareness. We aren't kind of totally on top of what we're supposed to be doing. It has the function of causing the power of intelligence, and here again, I think he's meaning by that the power in a positive way, just like we talked about the 5 powers earlier. The intelligence was one of those 5 powers. So it's causing the power of wisdom or intelligence. It's a very positive mental factor to decline, and the negative actions of body, speech, and mind to increase. It also hinders the production of the 4 remedial forces. The 4 remedial forces are the 4 opponent powers. Many of you know them by that name. They don't cause us to have any regret of what we're doing, to not have a reliance upon how to properly move in the opposite direction or purify those. It doesn't have us applying any remedy at the time, and it also would have no resolve or restraint from engaging in it again. Not generally speaking, Geshe Repton says, inattentiveness or non-introspection refers to any state of afflicted intelligence. Furthermore, whatever mental state arises while one is not fully conscious of the conduct of body, speech, and mind is said to be an afflicted form of intelligence, because it has the function of being the very cause for all moral downfalls. So it's kind of like, again, that we're using our wisdom in an afflicted way whenever these states of mind are present. We're not actually examining and distinguishing qualities correctly. And this is obviously, again, a good part of how the world functions, right? Is people finding their own sort of way of even almost rationalizing their behavior because they're holding to a particular way of looking at things that we could call it a wisdom, but nonetheless it's an afflicted wisdom that makes them rationalize why they say certain things or do certain things. And again, even becomes very subtle. As it says here, you don't even have that full consciousness of it, full awareness of it. There are 3 types of inattentiveness. This, again, wasn't in our text, but Geshe Repton says there is an inattentiveness or non-introspection that accompanies evil or wrong views. There is an inattentiveness that hinders the development of valid analytical intelligence. This is maybe what we've been calling like a more correct wisdom, or more valid wisdom. And then 3, the inattentiveness that interrupts mental quiescence. So again, that would be where we have, in conjunction with forgetfulness, which was forgetting the object, was the next one was an inattentiveness. That was the 3rd of the 4 of the 5 faults, not being aware of when lethargy and laxity and excitement arise in the mind. And so if we lack that introspection or that awareness, then the antidote is to apply introspection, to be aware of what's going on so that we can then apply an appropriate antidote. So it seems that, again, we've got three flavors to this. One that goes along with our engaging in what is evil, holding those kinds of views, what is wrong. One that gets in the way of our developing the more correct views, and then this one that is an obstacle to developing calm abiding or mental quiescence. He says these three types are respectively more and more subtle. So, and I would even question whether at the time of engaging in, you have a good intention of sitting down and engaging in calm abiding, and you're simply not having an introspection that is aware when subtle laxity, for example, is arising. I don't even know that that would be necessarily called, it certainly wouldn't be called non-virtuous. I mean, is it afflicted? I don't know. I guess it depends on what else is going on in the mind. But so this does happen with some of these, again, is that, and we're going to see this with distraction in particular, that some of what's presented in distraction isn't necessarily even afflicted. So, yes.
Come up with some synonyms for affliction.
Affliction.
Because I'm thinking of
Yeah.
Venerable Robina or sort of 18th century comments. Oh, I'm so
Oh, yeah. Well,
I mean, we don't say that.
Well, and I think the one that Venerable, Alex was asking for a synonym for affliction. We often talk about disturbing emotions as a synonym, because Venerable Robina says afflicted sounds like kind of 18th century thing or whatever. The term that she really likes is delusion. But, when we say the word delusion, we mean that it is a mind that is deluded, not looking at things correctly, that is actually, adhering to an incorrect view of things. But yeah.
Under the influence of the three poisons would be another way of.
Under the influence of the three poisons, or one of the three poisons at least. Yeah, I mean, we definitely say everything that's, I don't know. I'm curious, when we went into the afflictions, I know we had some slides and some part of the text that actually began the discussion of the afflictions about looking at this concept of affliction. The definition of an affliction, this is back on page 52, is a phenomenon such that when it arises, the characteristic of being very unpeaceful arises, and due to its arising, the mental continuum arises as being very unpeaceful. So unpeaceful. Unpeaceful, means it's disturbing, means that it is not allowing the mind to be resting in peace, to be resting in a state where more serenity is induced, where more being in line with reality. I mean, I think all of those could be part of what we mean by a peaceful mind. But yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I think for me, the main thing about affliction is it's a state of mind, non-virtue. And
Yeah.
the other way they often say is that it's a state of mind that leads to happiness, because non-virtue is negative karma, unhappiness or unpleasantness. So I think in general, it's, an affliction is something that really leads you into non-virtue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly it's the root of non-virtue. It's without affliction present in the mind, we wouldn't engage in non-virtue, because all non-virtue only arises on the basis of affliction, only arises together with an afflicted state of mind. But keep in mind, again, that we can have something that's called an affliction, like our ignorance of the nature of reality or our view of the transitory collection, that can arise with a virtuous state of mind even. So it's not to say that it's exclusively non-virtue that arises from the afflictions, but the afflictions do give rise to the non-virtues, and without afflictions you would not have non-virtue. Whereas the virtuous states of mind can be there with some afflictions, but they are not contingent upon those afflictions. They will actually arise completely within the space of this, correct wisdom that is seeing things as they are. So yeah, I think I don't know if that helps to give some other ideas of what to call these. Again, this term disturbing emotions gets at this idea of the unpeacefulness of them, but we don't, and this is something that you almost have to be quite attentive to really get how these things induce an unpeaceful mind, because most of them we really, some of them, those rooted in attachment, we often enjoy following them, right? So it doesn't feel like it's so unpeaceful. Anger, sure, anger doesn't feel that good to experience. Maybe some people get quite addicted to the mind of anger, and it actually feels good when they get angry or something. But for most of us, it doesn't feel that peaceful at all. So it's obvious in some states of mind when that peace is gone. But with minds like attachment, oftentimes it feels like, oh, we're doing something to make ourselves very happy. And happiness sometimes gets equated with peacefulness, but they're not the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in my mind, a lot of the peacefulness, I think, is that if you have a content, I think that the happiness in Buddhism is a sort of sense, which is essentially peaceful.
Right.
And unhappiness, unpeaceful, is sort of associated with pain.
Yeah.
And such, or discontent, it's like dukkha.
Right.
The sense is really not so much pain as discontent.
Right.
And an unpeaceful mind is a discontented
Right.
mind.
Yeah.
So it sort of has this sort of sense of suffering.
So again, and Bob was just pointing out that his take on peacefulness being more equated to contentment in Buddhism, which is true. I mean, and even when we talk about the word nirvana, means a pacification. It means that you have pacified the mind. Which it doesn't mean that you've gotten everything you wanted. It's not like attaining all this stuff. It's mean that you're free of what you don't want. You are no longer together with anything that disturbs the mind. So you have a deeper level of contentment that isn't contingent upon having these things in our lives, that is free of all those kinds of patterns. So I don't know, it's interesting stuff. So afflictions are that which does cause some unrest in our minds, and by virtue of that will frequently induce non-virtue, frequently induce us to engage in unhealthy mind states, unhealthy speech, unhealthy physical actions even. So I think I shared all of the slides for this, but we're at about 8:12, so I'm not sure whether we want to go on. We could talk a little bit about that, yeah. So Rachel's saying, if in terms of antidotes, is introspection the antidote to non-introspection? I would say so, yes. I mean, in an introspection, again, that is this more positive, aware, in line with realities force that is examining our behavior and knowing when we're going astray, not allowing us to kind of unknowingly go down that path. Because if we know what's going on, if we have that level of awareness, then we hopefully will correct it. Otherwise, we are falling into another delusion, another affliction that's causing us to continue to go against the teachings. We're lacking shame, or we're lacking consideration for others, or whatever it is that is going to propel us down that path. So I would say that that's probably, does anyone else have any ideas about what would be another antidote to this, to non-introspection? I mean, Master Shantideva's chapter 5 is really a good one to study, to get a good take on all of this and how important it is that we learn to focus on our minds and be aware of what's going on with our minds. That's the chapter that actually starts with showing how all of the perfections, the paramitas, are not perfected external to ourselves. They're only perfected within our own minds. So that's where the example for patience, they have the Master Shantideva saying that you could cover the entire earth in leather so that you'd never step on a sharp object again. You'd only have smooth leather to step on everywhere you go. Or you can put leather underneath your own feet. So the idea being that if we don't really do the work of attending to our minds, and that is really where the only work needs to be done, it would be impossible to find all the leather to cover the entire world so that we never stepped on anything that was harmful. So anyway, in that chapter, it emphasizes introspection as one of the main forces, mindfulness and introspection working in tandem. And that's why in meditation practice, those two are said to be the main tools to help us to develop calm abiding. There will be a time when introspection almost becomes sort of not so necessary because we've developed the mindfulness and the strength of mind to be with what is virtuous or whatever it is we're pursuing, to where we don't need to have that level of kind of checking in and knowing what's going on, at least in meditation practice. And I think it would carry over into our daily life. So I think introspection is probably the main tool that we would use as an antidote to this. And you might wonder, well, how do I develop introspection? Again, we don't have it as one of the mental factors, but I think it does come with, it's informed obviously by correct knowledge. If we don't have correct knowledge, then I don't think we have the correct introspection either, because we have to be having an introspection that is telling us what it is that we need to be doing at the time. So that what we need to be doing at the time is informed by the teachings on karma, is informed by, an attention to all of our different aspects of our behavior. Even what we're learning here in this course is part of informing us of an awareness of when something does become an affliction, when it becomes more correct knowledge, more virtuous. So, yeah.
I was just thinking, before you said correct knowledge, I was thinking that maybe wisdom was an antidote. So wisdom meaning the perfection of wisdom, or the correct, non-afflicted wisdom.
Yeah.
And then you said correct knowledge. I'm like, well, I'm getting close.
Very good. Yeah, Rich was saying she was thinking that wisdom would be maybe an antidote. But again, the introspection, we could say, is a part of our wisdom. And it is the wisdom that, in my estimation, is going to manifest as that ability to check our behavior, to check what's going on in the mind, to have a second set of eyes, in a sense, that allows us to know what's happening, as opposed to just go on autopilot and continue to follow more diluted states of mind. Very good. Okay, so we will begin with distraction. We'll destroy everything. Destroy all the afflictions, destroy the destructive emotions. Anyway, we'll carry on from there. As I said previously, we've got not a whole lot of the text left, but there's a really wonderful, very sweet part of the text at the end, the concluding discussion, where it kind of goes into some really nice practice advice on working with all of this. And so we'll make sure that we add in all of that and spend some time talking about that, because all that we have after this 20th of the secondary afflictions distraction is the 4 changeable mental factors, and there's some things to discuss there too. We might even extend that discussion to finding out, what are there other things that people might see as changeable mental factors that aren't on the list. I have one nominee, but anyway, I'll share that when we get to it. Because keep in mind, this 51 mental factors isn't a final number. This is just a presentation of how to parse up the mind and what's going on. I came up with a joke once about, why we only have 51 mental factors, and I said, oh, it's because we're not playing with a full deck. We had one more. Anyway. Sorry, I just had to include that. Okay, let's go to the prayer book. Thank you all for what you shared tonight, and it makes the discussion of all these so much richer with everyone else's contribution as well. So page 235, we're going to do the first 2 prayers there as usual. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Then page 244 for the long life prayers, these 2 brief prayers for His Holiness and Lama Zopa. As we recite these together, think that we're creating the causes for their good health and long lives, as well as the same for all of our precious teachers in this tradition and in all traditions who are helping sentient beings to find peace and happiness, to lessen their afflictions, to engage in more positive qualities. May all these beings have good health and long lives as well, and may we and others never be parted from perfect guides in all our lifetimes. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers, honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then finally dedicate for whoever you're holding in your heart right now. And we certainly do have people in our own community that we want to include in this, others that we know who are experiencing obstacles, who are experiencing illness, who are dying or who have died recently. Whoever these beings are that you're bringing to mind, kind of mentally send this energy out to them, all this positive energy we've created. So it becomes the cause for the relief of their suffering and for them to have all the causes that will lead to perfect peace and happiness. In this way, may all beings find true peace and happiness. Okay, thank you all very much. So keep in mind, we do have, we've been streaming these classes on Wednesday night, but we're going to stream all the Sunday classes that I'm teaching, at least until I leave, and we'll see if we can get that set up for Geshe-La's teachings as well. So if you need any information on that, talk to Rachel or myself, and we'll make sure that you have the link. Okay, thank you.